He said it like he was reading weather off a barn radio, calm, certain, familiar. She never served a day in the United States military, my father told the jury, and if she says otherwise, that is a bald-faced lie. 9 people looked at me. One of them had sold us seed corn when I was 12. One had gone to church with my mother for 20 years. Another had once handed me a peppermint in the lobby of this same courthouse when I was waiting to testify about a traffic accident I hadn't caused. I did not move. My father was suing me for stealing from my dead mother's trust. What he did not know, what his lawyer did not know, what the whole county did not know, was that inside my attorney's briefcase sat a sealed envelope from the Pentagon. And before this day was over, the judge would take off his glasses, look straight at me, and say 4 words that changed the air in the room. All rise. The water in the paper cup tasted like metal and old pipes. I remember that because when your life splits in two, the mind clings to useless details. The grain of the witness stand under your fingertips. The hum of fluorescent lights. The faint lemon smell of floor polish trying and failing to cover the odor of old wood damp files and my father's cologne, which had not changed since the Reagan administration. It was still too sharp, still applied like volume could substitute for dignity. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 43 years old that morning in the Marion County Courthouse, and I sat in the witness box listening to my father erase me in public with the confidence of a man who had never once mistaken his opinion for anything less than law. Harold Carter was 71, broad through the shoulders, even now his hands rough and knuckled from a life of land and machinery, and pointing at people when they disappointed him. In our part of Kentucky, his voice carried. He had chaired the county planning board for 12 years, served on the church finance committee for longer, and spent most of his adult life cultivating the kind of reputation that makes other men lower their tone when they disagree with you in public. He wore his charcoal blazer that day, the good one, funeral wool, board meeting wool, the one he saved for occasions where he wanted to look like reason itself. Across the aisle, his attorney Martin Bell stood beside the plaintiff's table with a yellow legal pad and a manila folder puffed full of papers he believed would bury me. Martin had practiced probate and land disputes in this county for 3 decades. He had the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to dealing with visible facts, signed deeds, tax maps, wills, utility records. He believed in what could be pulled from a file drawer. The trouble with men like Martin Bell is that they assume the whole world fits in a file drawer. The trust, he told the jury, pacing with easy authority, required that any beneficiary receiving distributions be actively employed in public service or engaged in documented lawful work. The defendant, he turned and gestured toward me with an open hand, polished enough to pass for courtesy, claimed military service and later federal employment as the basis for these disbursements. Claimed. Not performed, not completed, claimed. He held up a document. But our investigation found no verifiable military record accessible through standard channels, no public employment file consistent with her statements, and no evidence that Ms. Carter served in any capacity she has alleged to family members over the years. Alleged to family members. That was another neat trick. Reduced 21 years of service to kitchen table mythology. My attorney Daniel Mercer sat at the defense table without interruption. He was 48, former Army JAG, neat in a dark suit, his silver tie clipped exactly straight. He had the kind of stillness that makes noisy men underestimate you. He did not fidget. He did not whisper useless reassurances. He had reviewed every document, every letter, every insult disguised as evidence. He knew what could be said and what could not. More importantly, he knew what was coming. He also knew better than to move too soon. I folded my hands on the rail in front of me. People say that when you're accused of something monstrous, your body betrays you. Your pulse climbs, your face flushes, your breathing changes. Mine didn't. Training settles into the bones after enough years. You learn that posture is not just posture. It is message. It is containment. It is the difference between being read and remaining sealed. My younger sister Beth sat 3 rows behind my father in a navy cardigan, both hands clamped around her purse strap. She had not looked at me once since entering the courtroom. That hurt more than I expected. Not because Beth had chosen his side, I had been prepared for that, but because some part of me, some small, stupid part that should have died years ago, had still hoped she would look up and see me before the room told her who I was. Instead, she kept her eyes lowered like a woman in church when the hymn turns toward confession. The case itself was almost insultingly simple. My mother, Marion Carter, had created a family trust 2 years before she died. Nothing enormous by city standards, significant by county standards. Enough to matter, enough to help, enough if weaponized to wound. She had written into it a condition I recognized immediately as her quiet attempt to protect what she could no longer protect directly. Distributions to her daughters required evidence of active work service or employment. My mother understood my father better than anyone ever had. She knew that if she left him breathing room, he would turn procedure into punishment. She was right. 3 months after her funeral, he challenged every distribution I had received. He hired an investigator. He made calls. He asked questions at the VFW, at the tax office, at the clerk's window, at church suppers, at the feed store. By the time the petition was filed, half the county had heard some version of the same story Evelyn had run off years ago, invented a military career no one could prove, and now she was siphoning money from her dead mother while hiding behind a fake government job. In a town like ours, repetition matures into truth faster than evidence. Ms. Carter Martin Bell said, turning toward me, "Would you please explain to the jury why, if you truly served in the armed forces of the United States, there appears to be no ordinary record of that service available through any of the channels our investigator used?" Daniel rose half an inch. Your Honor asked and answered in substance. Judge Raymond Ellison looked over the bench. Overruled. She may answer. I lifted my eyes to Martin first, then to the jury. Bill Cawley in seat 4 had fixed our tractor once when I was 16. Mrs. Devers in seat 7 had brought potato salad to my mother's visitation. They all looked politely doubtful. That was the thing about public humiliation in a small county. It rarely arrives with malice. More often it arrives wearing manners. My records exist, I said. Martin smiled faintly. Then where are they? The room held itself still. I could feel my father watching me, not with uncertainty, but with appetite. He had waited years for this. Years to drag me into a place where silence could be mistaken for guilt, and privacy could be framed as deceit. I kept my voice level. Not all service is designed for public convenience, I said. A murmur moved so softly through the gallery, it was almost just fabric shifting against wood. Martin turned to the jury as if I had handed him a gift. So your answer is that the evidence cannot be seen because it is too secret to verify. No, I said. My answer is that your inability to access something does not mean it doesn't exist. That was when my father rose. The scrape of his chair across the courtroom floor cut through the air sharp as sheet metal. He did not shout. Harold Carter never shouted when he could project instead. Projection carried more authority, more church basement authority, more town hall authority, more father authority. She is lying, he said. The judge's expression tightened. Mr. Carter, sit down. But my father kept his eyes on me. She left this family, she left her mother to carry the whole burden, and now she wants this court to believe she was off serving her country in some invisible capacity nobody can prove. He pointed at me, thick finger steady. She never served a day in uniform, not one, and if she says different, it is a bald-faced lie. I looked at him then, really looked. At the red threading in the whites of his eyes, at the hard set of his jaw, at the satisfaction hidden beneath the outrage. He thought this moment made him righteous. He thought truth was whatever survived longest in his mouth. Daniel Mercer stood. Your Honor, he said quietly, the defense would like permission to submit a document not previously available during discovery. Martin Bell turned already frowning. My father blinked once. Beth finally lifted her head. Daniel placed one hand on his briefcase, and for the first time that morning I felt the room begin to change. The first thing people misunderstand about silence is that they think it means nothing is happening. In my family, silence meant something very specific. It meant someone else was speaking for you. I learned that before I learned how to drive a tractor. Growing up on Carter land 5 miles outside of Millhaven meant you understood early that words had weight, but not everyone's words weighed the same. My father's voice carried. Mine did not. Not because I didn't speak. I did. I just spoke in a way that required people to listen instead of follow, and listening was never my father's strength. The house itself was a long, low structure built in the late 70s, with a wraparound porch that sagged just enough on the east side to collect rainwater in a shallow arc. The kitchen smelled like coffee and bacon grease most mornings, the kind of smell that settles into wood and never quite leaves. There was a clock above the sink that ran 2 minutes fast, which my father insisted was a discipline tool, and my mother called Harold's way of arguing with time. I was the older daughter. That fact mattered more than I understood at the time. Older meant expectations without explanation. It meant you were supposed to know how to behave without being told. It meant you were measured not by what you did right, but by how much less trouble you caused compared to what your father imagined you could. My sister Beth was born 5 years after me, and from the moment she could talk, she knew how to laugh at the right time. She knew how to soften a room. She knew how to make my father feel seen in a way that translated directly into approval. Beth fit. That's the simplest way to say it. She fit into the shape my father believed a daughter should take: helpful, warm, agreeable, rooted. She stayed close. She learned the rhythms of the house and moved with them instead of against them. When my father made a joke, she laughed before the punchline was finished. When he gave instructions, she nodded before he was done speaking. I, on the other hand, asked questions. Not loud questions, not defiant questions, just precise ones. Why that way? What happens if we try it differently? Is that how it's always been done, or just how you do it? Questions in my father's world were not curiosity. They were friction. I remember one afternoon when I was 14, standing in the barn aisle with a ledger book in my hands, trying to reconcile feed costs that didn't line up with the receipts he had stapled to the page. The numbers were off. Not by much, but enough that it mattered. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice even, "this total doesn't match the receipts from last week." He didn't even look at the book. "It's fine," he said. "It's off by $43. Now he looked. Not at the page, at me. "You planning on running this place someday?" he asked. "I just want it to add up." "It adds up because I say it does." That was the end of the conversation. My mother Marion stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the mudroom, a dish towel in her hands. She watched the exchange the way she watched storms roll in over the back field, aware, alert, but not intervening unless she absolutely had to. Later that night, she came into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. "You're not wrong," she said quietly. "I know." She smiled, a little tired but kind. Knowing and saying are two different things in this house. "Then what am I supposed to do?" She took a breath before answering. My mother never rushed answers. She weighed them like she was balancing something delicate. "You learn when it matters," she said, "and when it doesn't." That was her way. She didn't fight my father head on. She adjusted around him. She found quiet ways to protect what she could without breaking the structure she was living inside. She kept copies of things. She wrote notes in margins. She remembered details other people forgot. And she watched me. I didn't understand then that she was measuring something, not my obedience, not my usefulness, but my endurance. By the time I was 18, I knew two things with absolute clarity. First, if I stayed, I would always be the version of myself my father found lacking. Second, leaving would cost me everything I understood as home. I chose leaving. There was no ceremony to it, no send-off, no dinner, no speech, just a duffel bag on the porch and a ride into town in my father's truck that rattled every time we hit a patch of uneven road. We didn't talk much during that drive. At the bus station, he put the truck in park and kept both hands on the wheel. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Yes." "You think the military's going to fix whatever it is you think is wrong with you?" I didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer he would accept. He nodded once like he had confirmed something for himself. "Don't come back here looking for a bailout," he said. "We take care of our own. We don't carry people who won't carry their weight." "I won't," I said. He looked at me, then really looked like he was trying to decide if I believed what I was saying or if I was just saying it to leave. "Good," he said, "because I won't do it." That was the last conversation we had before I left for basic training. My mother hugged me at the door that morning, not in front of him, after he had stepped out to check the truck. She held on longer than usual. "Write when you can," she said into my shoulder. "I will." "And Evelyn?" "Yes." She pulled back just enough to look at me. Her eyes were steady. "Not everything you do will be understood," she said. "That doesn't make it wrong." I nodded. At the time, I thought she meant the military. I would later understand she meant everything that came after. Basic training stripped things down fast. It removed the parts of you that were performative and left behind the parts that functioned under pressure. I found something there that I had never found at home. Clarity. In the Army, questions weren't disrespect if they were asked at the right time in the right way for the right reason. Precision mattered. Accuracy mattered. Results mattered. It was the first environment I had ever been in where being exact was not a flaw to be corrected. I wrote letters home at first. My mother wrote back. My father didn't. When I finished training and moved into my first assignment, the letters became less frequent. Not because I stopped caring, but because the life I was entering did not translate easily onto paper. There were things I could say and things I couldn't. The space between those two categories grew wider with every year. Beth sent a few notes early on, short, bright, full of small-town updates. Who got married, who moved away, what the weather had done to the corn that season. Eventually, those stopped too. Not abruptly, just gradually, the way contact fades when it isn't actively held in place. By the time my mother got sick, the distance between us was no longer just miles. It was narrative. My father had filled in the gaps I left with a version of me that made sense to him. Evelyn left. Evelyn didn't come back. Evelyn doesn't talk about what she does. Evelyn must not be doing anything worth talking about. And in a town where visibility is the same thing as truth, that story held. When the diagnosis came, I returned as often as I could. Not as often as my father believed I should. Not as often as Beth managed. But I came. Hospitals have their own kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the layering of it monitors footsteps, distant voices, all softened by walls that have seen too much to carry anything sharply anymore. My mother never asked me for details. She never asked what I did. She asked if I was safe. She asked if I was eating. She asked if I was sleeping. And once, only once, when we were alone and the machines were quiet for a moment, she said, "Are you where you're supposed to be?" "Yes," I said. She studied my face like she was verifying something only she could see. "Good," she said. "Then don't let anyone make you smaller than that." She died in January. The ground was hard. The sky was low. The kind of cold that settles into your joints and stays there. At the reading of the will, my father sat at the head of the table like he always had, hands folded, expression fixed in something that could pass for grief if you didn't know him well enough to recognize control. The trust was explained. The conditions were read. When it was over, he didn't look at me. He looked at the attorney and said, "We'll be reviewing all distributions." That was the moment the next chapter started. Not in anger, not in shouting, in procedure. 3 months later, I was served with a lawsuit. Trust fraud. And in my father's version of events, it was the most logical thing in the world. Because if he couldn't see what I had done with my life, then it must not exist. There are jobs you can explain over dinner. And there are jobs you learn to carry in silence. By my 6th year in uniform, I had stopped trying to translate what I did into anything that sounded normal. Not because I thought my family couldn't understand it, but because understanding wasn't the problem. Permission was. Some things don't belong to the person doing them. They belong to the work itself, to the structure that requires them, to the people depending on them, to the consequences that follow if they're handled carelessly. I learned that the first time someone took a marker to a document I had written and blacked out half the page. Not because it was wrong, because it was too right. My early assignments were ordinary enough on paper: communications analysis, pattern tracking. The kind of work that doesn't make headlines but decides what happens before headlines exist. You look at fragments. You build context. You learn the difference between noise and signal, between coincidence and pattern, between what looks important and what actually is. It suited me. Precision always had. In my father's world, precision was a challenge to authority. In mine, it was survival. I moved where I was told to move. I learned what I was told to learn. I kept my head down, my work clean, my voice measured. That was how you advanced in that environment, not by announcing yourself, but by becoming someone people trusted with things they didn't say out loud. Trust in that line of work is rarely verbal. It's assigned. The first time my role shifted, it wasn't announced either. There was no ceremony, no speech, just a conversation in an office that required 2 separate badges to enter. "You're being reassigned," the man across from me said, sliding a folder across the desk. Where I asked. He didn't answer that directly. "You'll be given a cover designation," he said. "Administrative analysis, contract support, nothing that invites questions." "And the actual work?" He met my eyes not unkindly. "The actual work is why you're here." That was the moment I understood that my life had just split into 2 tracks. One that could be described, and one that couldn't. On paper, I became a mid-level analyst attached to a logistics group, with a name bland enough to pass through most conversations without leaving a trace. My address moved to a DC mailing block that looked like 100 others. My salary aligned with a role that sounded stable, predictable, forgettable. In reality, I spent my days in rooms where the clocks were synchronized to systems you didn't question, and the doors closed behind you with a sound that told you exactly how far from ordinary life you had just stepped. You learn to live like that. You learn how to answer questions without answering them, how to speak in layers, how to give enough truth to satisfy curiosity without crossing lines you don't get to redraw once they're crossed. When Beth called in those early years, her voice was still light, still easy. "So what do you actually do all day?" she asked once, laughing a little. "Dad says you sit in an office pushing papers." I could hear him in the background, his voice low but present, shaping the space even when he wasn't part of the conversation. "I work in analysis," I said. "Same contracts, different problems." She paused. "That sounds vague?" "It is," I said. She laughed again, but softer this time. "Well, as long as you're happy." Happiness wasn't the metric. Function was. I told my mother the same thing when she asked. She never pushed. She didn't need details to understand direction. As the years passed, my visits home became less frequent, not because I didn't want to be there, but because being there required a version of myself that no longer fit cleanly over the one I had become. Conversations stayed on the surface. Questions stayed small. My father stopped asking entirely. Silence in his hands became something else. Not absence. Judgment. "You still in DC?" he asked once over speakerphone, his tone flat. "Yes." "Doing what?" "Analysis." A pause. "That must be nice," he said. "Safe, comfortable. Someone has to keep the paperwork moving while the rest of the country does the real work." I didn't correct him. Correction with him was not information. It was opposition. And opposition invited escalation. By the time my mother's health began to decline, the narrative about me in Millhaven had settled into something fixed. I was the daughter who left. The daughter who never really came back. The daughter who said she worked for the government but couldn't explain how. The daughter who, in my father's words, had found a way to make a living without ever getting her hands dirty. What people don't understand about that kind of narrative is how efficiently it fills space. Once it exists, it answers questions before they're asked. Why isn't she here more often? Because she doesn't care. Why doesn't she talk about her work? Because there's nothing to talk about. Why does she live so far away? Because she couldn't make it here. It becomes a system. Self-sustaining. My mother saw it happening. She never confronted it directly. That wasn't her way. But she made adjustments where she could. The trust was one of them. She didn't tell me she was creating it. I learned about it the same way everyone else did, sitting in a quiet office with a lawyer who read the terms in a voice that carried just enough neutrality to make them feel final. "The trust provides for equal distributions to both daughters," he said. "Conditional upon demonstration of active employment, public service, or lawful work engagement at the time of disbursement." I understood immediately. My mother had built a safeguard. Not against me. Against interpretation. She knew my father would try to control what she left behind. This was her way of limiting how far that control could reach. At the time, I thought it would be enough. I underestimated how far a man will go to prove himself right. The first challenge came quietly. A letter. Formal, structured, written by an attorney whose name I recognized from land disputes and estate filings across the county. It requested documentation. Proof of employment. Verification of service. Reasonable on its face. Except that the documentation it asked for was the kind I could not produce in the form it expected. I responded through appropriate channels. Limited confirmation. Enough to satisfy the requirement as it was written, if not as it was interpreted. The second letter was less polite. The third included a demand. The fourth was a notice. By then, my father had already begun telling people what he believed. "She's been taking money she didn't earn," he said at the diner over coffee that sat too long on the burner. "Says she's been in the military all these years. Funny how nobody can prove it." At church, the story shifted slightly. "We did our part here," he told the pastor. "Kept things going, took care of her mother, and now she shows up when there's money involved." At the feed store, it hardened. "She's living off a story," he said, "always has." Each version carried the same core. I wasn't just absent. I was dishonest. By the time the lawsuit was filed, the narrative had matured into something that felt to everyone hearing it like common sense. Of course she couldn't prove it. Of course the records didn't exist. Of course she had found a way to work the system. The petition itself was precise. It alleged that I had knowingly misrepresented my employment status in order to receive distributions from the trust. It cited the investigators' findings. It framed my inability to produce standard documentation as evidence of fabrication. It asked the court to recover the funds and to declare me ineligible for future distributions. It was in its structure clean, logical, built on absence. That was the part my father never understood. Absence is not proof. It is space. And space given enough time can be filled with anything. In his case, it was filled with certainty. By the time I stepped into that courtroom, he wasn't guessing anymore. He believed. And belief in a man like him does not bend easily. What he had built over the years, a story about a daughter who left, who failed, who hid, was about to collide with something he had never accounted for. Not contradiction. Confirmation. Just not the kind he expected. By the time the petition was filed, my father had already tried the case in every room that mattered to him. Not in a courtroom. At the diner on Main where the coffee is poured before you sit down, and the truth is whatever survives the longest at the counter. At the church basement between folding chairs and casseroles where sympathy has a way of aligning itself with the loudest certainty. At the feed store where men lean on sacks of grain and speak in conclusions, not questions. He didn't shout there either. He didn't need to. My daughter says she served, he'd tell them voice steady, almost reluctant, as if the words pained him. "But we've looked. Nothing comes up, no records anyone can find. And now she's taking money from her mother's trust like she earned it." It was the tone that did the work. Not angry. Disappointed. Disappointment travels further. By the time I received the official notice, the story had already settled into the county like a weather pattern. People didn't need to verify it. They recognized it. It fit into the shape of other stories they already believed. The daughter who leaves. The daughter who doesn't come back. The daughter who claims more than she's done. When the court date was set, I knew exactly what I was walking into. Not just a legal proceeding. A correction. My father intended to correct the record in the only place left that could make it official. The Marion County Courthouse hadn't changed since I was a kid. Same oak doors, same scuffed steps, same long hallway that carried voices further than people realized. The same clock above the clerk's window, always a few minutes off, like time itself had decided not to argue with the building. Daniel and I arrived early. He didn't speak much as we walked in. He didn't need to. His presence was its own kind of preparation, measured, controlled, attentive to things most people missed. He nodded to the clerk, signed us in, and chose our table without hesitation. "Everything is in place," he said quietly as he set his briefcase down. I knew what that meant. The authorization had come through. Not easily. Not quickly. But it had come. "Understood," I said. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual. Not concern. Assessment. "You're good?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded once. That was all the reassurance either of us required. The room filled slowly. People don't rush into court in a town like ours. They arrive in small groups, take their seats, exchange looks that carry more conversation than words. By the time the bailiff called the session to order, most of the seats were occupied. Not by strangers. By witnesses to a version of my life I didn't recognize. Beth slipped in just before it started taking her place behind our father. She sat close enough to him that their shoulders almost touched, but not quite. That small distance said more than anything she might have spoken. My father didn't look back. He didn't need to check if she was there. He assumed. Judge Raymond Ellison entered from the side door robe, moving just enough to remind the room that authority had arrived. He was older than my father, maybe by a few years, with silver hair cut close and glasses that sat low on his nose when he read. He had the posture of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where decisions carried consequences. He took his seat, scanned the room once, and gave a short nod. "Be seated." Martin Bell stood immediately, smooth as habit. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began and launched into his opening with the kind of confidence that comes from believing your evidence is both complete and sufficient. He laid it out cleanly. The trust. The condition. My claim of service. The investigation. The absence of proof. He held up the investigator's report like it was a cornerstone. "No record," he said, tapping the page lightly. "No confirmation, no documentation that can be verified through any standard civilian or governmental channel available to us." He paused just long enough to let that settle. "In a matter like this, Your Honor, absence is not just absence, it is evidence." I watched Judge Ellison's face as Martin said that. There was a flicker there. Small. Almost nothing. But it was there. Daniel stood when it was our turn. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to outperform Martin. He spoke the way he always did, like every word had already been measured before it left his mouth. "The plaintiff's case," he said, "rests entirely on what he cannot find. Not on what does not exist, but on what is not available to him." He let that distinction hang. "There are categories of service," he continued, "and categories of employment that are not accessible through the channels the plaintiff has used. The absence of publicly available documentation does not equate to the absence of service." Martin shifted slightly. "Your Honor," he said, "if the defense intends to rely on records that cannot be examined, then we are dealing with claims that cannot be tested. That is not evidence, that is assertion." Daniel didn't look at him. "That is a misunderstanding of what constitutes verification in certain contexts," he said. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers resting on the edge of the bench. "We'll get to that," he said. The proceedings moved forward. Witnesses. Documents. The investigator took the stand and walked through his process step by step. Databases searched, offices contacted, records requested, every path leading to the same conclusion. "I found no verifiable record of military service under the defendant's name that could be confirmed through standard channels," he said. "None at all?" Martin asked. "None that could be verified, no." Martin nodded, satisfied. When it was Daniel's turn to cross-examine, he asked only a few questions. "You said standard channels, correct?" "Yes." "Are you trained or authorized to access restricted or classified records?" "Number." "Are you aware that certain categories of service are not reflected in the databases you searched?" A pause. "I'm aware that not everything is public," the investigator said carefully. "But your conclusion," Daniel said, "is based on what you were able to access." "Yes." Daniel nodded once. No further questions. It was enough. Not to convince. Not yet. But enough to create a space where certainty didn't sit as comfortably. When my turn came, the room seemed to lean in. I took the stand again, the wood of the rail familiar now under my hands. The same 9 faces, the same polite suspicion, the same quiet expectation that I would either confirm what they already believed or fail trying. Martin approached, his tone courteous. "Ms. Carter." He said, "You've heard the testimony regarding the absence of verifiable records. I'm going to ask you again. Plainly, can you provide this court with any documentation, any evidence that confirms you have served in the United States military?" Daniel's hand rested flat on the table. "Not yet." I kept my eyes on Martin. "My records are accurate," I said. "That's not what I asked," he replied, still polite, still controlled. "I asked if you can provide documentation that this court can review." I held his gaze. "Not in the form you're requesting." A murmur. Martin inclined his head slightly as if conceding something. "Then we are left," he said, turning toward the jury, with a claim that cannot be substantiated, a claim that by the defendant's own admission cannot be supported by evidence available to this court. My father shifted in his seat. I could feel it more than see it. He was ready. Ready to step in, ready to reinforce, ready to make sure the story landed exactly where he had always intended it to. And he did. He stood again slower this time, but with the same certainty. "She's had years," he said, voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room. "Years to come clean, years to show something, anything. And she hasn't." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Carter." "She's been lying," my father continued, not raising his volume, just increasing its weight. "To us, to this county, to her own mother." He turned slightly, not just addressing the court now, but the people behind him. "She says she served," he said, "but there's nothing there. No proof, no record, no one who can confirm it." He pointed at me again. "That's not service," he said. "That's a story." The room held. For a moment, everything balanced on that word. Story. Daniel stood. This time he didn't wait for the judge to prompt him. "Your Honor," he said, voice, even the defense moves to introduce a sealed document into evidence. Martin turned, already shaking his head. "Objection," he said. "Discovery has closed. Any new evidence should have been disclosed prior to trial." Daniel didn't look at him. "This document was not available prior to trial," he said. "It required authorization from federal authorities. That authorization has now been granted." The air shifted. Not visibly. Not audibly. But something in the room tightened. Judge Ellison leaned forward slightly. "What kind of document are we talking about, Mr. Mercer?" Daniel placed his hand on the briefcase. "A verification letter," he said, "issued under seal, confirming the defendant's service status." Martin opened his mouth to object again. The judge raised a hand. "Bring it forward," he said. Daniel lifted the briefcase onto the table, opened it, and for the first time since the proceedings began, everyone in that room realized this case might not be what they thought it was. Daniel didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed as he opened the briefcase, how deliberately unhurried he was, as if speed itself would be a form of disrespect. The latches clicked open with a soft, precise sound that seemed louder than it should have been in a room that quiet. Inside, beneath a legal pad and two neatly stacked folders, lay a single white envelope. Not large, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The paper was heavier than standard stock, the edges sharp, the surface matte in a way that absorbed the overhead light instead of reflecting it. On its face, centered and embossed, was the seal eagle shield, the geometry of authority rendered in blue and gold. Along the left edge ran a narrow classification stripe, subtle to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, definitive to anyone who did. Daniel lifted it with both hands. He didn't wave it. He didn't display it. He carried it. There is a difference. He walked it to the bench the way you carry something that changes conversations before it's even opened, the kind of object that doesn't need explanation to alter the air around it. Judge Ellison accepted it without comment. For a moment he didn't open it. He held it. His eyes moved across the surface seal to stripe to return block back to the seal again. Then slowly, his gaze lifted from the envelope and crossed the room. It passed over Martin Bell, who was still standing near the jury box, lips parted as if an objection had been interrupted mid-breath. It moved over my father, who had leaned forward in his chair, not yet concerned but alert, in the way a man becomes when something enters his field of view that he doesn't immediately understand. Then the judge's eyes reached me, and stopped. Not on my face. Lower. To the small matte gray pin on the lapel of my jacket. Most people in that room had ignored it. Some had probably assumed it was decorative. Something picked up in a store, worn out of habit, meaningless. Judge Ellison didn't look at it like that. He looked at it like a man who had seen it before. Once. Twice. Enough times to recognize what it was not. He returned his attention to the envelope. Broke the seal. The paper inside slid free with a soft, controlled motion. He unfolded it, his fingers careful in a way that suggested familiarity with documents that were not meant to be handled casually. His eyes began to move. Left to right. Top to bottom. Then back to the top again. The room didn't breathe. The ceiling fan continued its slow rotation. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the hallway beyond the closed doors, a distant footstep echoed and faded. I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 5, he stopped reading. At 6, he set the paper flat on the bench. At 7, he reached up and removed his glasses. He placed them carefully beside the document, aligning them with the edge of the wood, as if even that small act required order. When he looked up again, something in his posture had shifted. Subtle, but complete. He wasn't just presiding anymore. He was recognizing. "Mr. Mercer," he said, voice low, steady, "has your client authorized the limited disclosure permitted under this document?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "She has, Your Honor." The judge nodded once. Then he turned his attention to the room. "All rise." The words didn't need to be loud. They carried anyway. The bailiff stood first, chair legs scraping lightly against the floor. Then the court reporter. Then one by one the jurors, Bill Cawley slower than the rest, his hand gripping the arm of his chair, as if the room had tilted slightly and he was compensating for it. Martin Bell stood, but not cleanly. There was a hitch in the motion, a fraction of a second, where his body resisted what his mind hadn't yet caught up to. My father did not stand immediately. He remained seated, hands on his knees, eyes fixed on the judge as if waiting for clarification. "Mr. Carter," the judge said without raising his voice. "That was enough." My father stood. Beth rose beside him, one hand already lifting toward her mouth. Daniel was already on his feet. I stood last. Not out of hesitation. Out of timing. The room reoriented itself around that single command. Judge Ellison placed both hands flat on the bench. "I am going to make a limited statement for the record," he said. "Based on the contents of the document submitted under seal, and the authorization provided, this court recognizes that the defendant's service record exists under restricted classification protocols." Martin opened his mouth. "Your Honor." The judge's gaze cut toward him. Not sharp. Not angry. Final. "You will have an opportunity to respond, Mr. Bell," he said. "You will not interrupt." Martin closed his mouth. The judge continued. "The absence of publicly accessible documentation in this instance is not indicative of absence of service. It is consistent with the nature of the service described in the verification provided." A ripple moved through the jury. Confusion first. Then something else. Recalibration. My father's fingers tightened against his pant legs. I watched the tendons in his hands shift, the same hands that had fixed fences, lifted feed-signed checks pointed at me across kitchen tables. Hands that had always known what they were dealing with. Until now. The document further confirms the judge said that the defendant has maintained continuous service in the United States Armed Forces for a period exceeding 2 decades. The words landed clean. No emphasis. No embellishment. They didn't need either. Martin's folder slipped from his hand. It hit the floor with a soft, papery sound that seemed to echo more than it should have. He didn't pick it up. Beth's hand fully covered her mouth, now her eyes wide, fixed on me as if trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same person and failing to make them fit. My father didn't move. He stood there upright but hollowed, as if something had been removed from the center of him without warning. "You may be seated," the judge said. The room lowered itself back into place. Slower this time. More carefully. Like everyone was aware that something fundamental had shifted and they weren't entirely sure how to sit inside it yet. I remained standing for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then I sat. Daniel sat beside me, his movements as precise as they had been from the beginning. Martin bent down, finally retrieving his folder, but the smoothness was gone now. The edges of his confidence had softened, frayed by information he had not anticipated, could not access, and did not fully understand. "Your Honor," he said, voice measured but thinner, "we would request an opportunity to review the document in question." "You will not be reviewing the document in full," Judge Ellison said. "You will be provided with the portions authorized for disclosure, nothing further." Martin nodded once. It was all he could do. The judge turned slightly, his attention moving back toward the center of the room. In light of the verification now before the court, he said, "I will ask counsel for the plaintiff a direct question." He paused, just long enough for the weight of what was coming to settle. "Does the plaintiff wish to proceed with this action?" Silence. Not the empty kind. The kind that demands an answer. Martin looked at my father. My father didn't look back. His eyes were still on me. And for the first time since this had started, he wasn't certain. Martin Bell leaned toward my father and said something under his breath. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't need to. I had seen that posture before men in rooms where the ground shifts under them trying to gather something they can still stand on. His hand hovered just above my father's shoulder, not quite touching, as if contact might confirm what he didn't yet want to accept. My father didn't respond. Not immediately. He kept his eyes on me, but the certainty that had been there an hour earlier, the quiet, immovable certainty of a man who believed he understood the shape of things, had begun to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but visibly. "Your Honor," Martin said, finally straightening, "we would request a brief recess to confer with our client." "No," Judge Ellison said. The word landed flat, not harsh, not raised, but final in a way that closed the door on argument before it could form. "The court has reviewed a verified document issued under federal authority," he continued. "The plaintiff's claim rests on the assertion that the defendant did not meet the employment or service requirements outlined in the trust. That assertion has now been contradicted by the highest level of verification available to this court." Martin swallowed. "I understand, Your Honor, but—" "You have 30 seconds," the judge said, "to advise your client and inform this court whether you intend to proceed." There are moments when time changes texture. 30 seconds can stretch. It can hold more than it should. Martin turned back to my father, bent down again, spoke more urgently this time. I watched the exchange the way I had learned to watch everything, without interruption, without assumption, noting what was said and what wasn't. My father's lips moved once. A single word. Short. Flat. Martin straightened slowly. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiff withdraws the complaint." The sentence felt like something placed carefully on a surface that might collapse if handled roughly. Judge Ellison nodded once. "The complaint is dismissed with prejudice." The gavel did not fall. It didn't need to. Furthermore, the judge continued, picking up a pen, "The court will assess sanctions against the plaintiff for costs incurred, including legal fees and administrative expenses associated with the verification process required by this action." He wrote for a moment. The sound of pen on paper carried farther than it should have. "The amount will be set at $24,800. Martin closed his eyes briefly. My father didn't move. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, looking up now, his voice shifting, not softer but directed, precise. "You brought this court a claim grounded in an absence you assumed to be evidence. You pursued it without consideration for the nature of the service in question, and you did so publicly." He paused, long enough for every word that followed to land clean. "You were not misled by the facts, sir. You were limited by your understanding of them." No one in the room spoke. My father's hands, those hands that had always been steady, always been certain, now rested loosely at his sides. The fingers no longer curled with purpose. They hung as if they had forgotten what they were meant to hold. Judge Ellison turned his attention back to me. "Ms. Carter," he said. I met his gaze. "The court acknowledges the unusual circumstances under which your service required verification," he continued. "Your record will remain sealed. The contents of the document submitted will not enter public record beyond the limited confirmation provided here today." I nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor." 4 words. Measured. Sufficient. He inclined his head. "That will be all." The room did not move immediately. People rarely do when something they believed has just been replaced with something they didn't expect. It takes a moment for the body to catch up to the shift. Then chairs began to scrape. Papers gathered. Voices returned in low, uncertain tones. The jury filed out, but not the way they had come in. They avoided looking at my father now, not out of hostility, out of recalibration. Bill Cawley glanced at me once, brief, almost apologetic, then looked away. Martin collected his things with care that bordered on fragility, as if each paper might cut him if handled incorrectly. Beth stood in the aisle, not moving, her eyes still on me. My father remained where he was. For a long time. Long enough that the space around him began to clear. Long enough that the room reorganized itself without him at its center. I stood. Stepped down from the witness box. My shoes made almost no sound on the floor. Daniel gathered his briefcase, closing it with the same precise motion he had opened it, with the envelope now returned to its place inside. We moved toward the aisle. Beth shifted, then taking a step forward. Evelyn, she said. My name in her voice sounded unfamiliar. Not wrong, just unused. I stopped. Turned. 15 years is a long time to compress into a single moment. Her eyes were red now, though I hadn't seen her cry. Her hands were still near her face, fingers pressed together as if holding something in place. I didn't know, she said. The sentence came out thin. Not defensive. Not argumentative. Just incomplete. I looked at her. Really looked. At the lines that hadn't been there when I left. At the way she held herself still close to the shape of our father, but not entirely inside it anymore. I know what he told you, I said. She shook her head slightly. No, she said. I mean, I didn't know any of it. I thought. She stopped. Words failing her. Or refusing to cooperate with what she now understood. Why didn't you tell us, she asked. There it was. The question that always comes after the truth surfaces. Why didn't you make it easier for us to believe you? I held her gaze. You weren't asking, I said. She flinched. Not outwardly. Internally. A small retreat behind her eyes. I would have listened, she said. Would you, I asked. Not sharply. Not accusing. Just precise. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Because somewhere in that space she found the answer she didn't want to give. I didn't soften it. Comfort in that moment would have been dishonest. I didn't keep things from you to hurt you, I said. I kept them because they weren't mine to give. Her shoulders dropped slightly. The fight left her. Or maybe it had never been there to begin with. I'm sorry, she said. I believed her. Partially. That's how trust returns. Not whole. Not immediately. In pieces. Behind her, I could see my father finally move. Slowly. He stood, but the motion lacked the structure it had carried his entire life. His spine didn't lock into place the way it used to. His shoulders didn't square with the same automatic authority. He looked at me. And for the first time in years, he didn't look like a man addressing a problem. He looked like a man confronting something he did not understand. Evelyn, he said. My name sounded different in his voice now, too. Less certain. He took a step forward. Stopped. You said you were in D.C., he said. You said you were doing analysis. I said. That's not, he began, then stopped himself. Because he didn't have the language. Not for what he had just seen. Not for what had been confirmed. You were in the military, he asked. The question was almost childlike. Stripped of everything that had come before it. I held his gaze. Yes. For how long? 21 years. The number landed between us. Heavy. He blinked. Once. Twice. You never told me that, he said. I didn't look away. You never asked me anything that required me to answer it, I said. He absorbed that. Or tried to. His jaw moved, searching for the old line, the one that had always anchored him. It didn't come. General, he said. The word sounded wrong in his mouth. Not incorrect. Unfamiliar. I didn't respond to it. Not because it wasn't accurate. Because it wasn't necessary. Titles matter in some rooms. Not in this one. I let the silence sit. Not passive. Not empty. Deliberate. After a moment, I turned. Walked past Daniel. Past the rows of seats. Past the place where my father stood no longer at the center of anything. The hallway outside felt different. Cooler. Cleaner. Air that hadn't been shaped by expectation. Daniel caught up to me near the exit. Sanctions will stand, he said. He'll try to appeal. It won't go anywhere. I know, I said. He studied me for a second. You handled that well, he added. I handled it, I said. That was enough. We stepped outside. The sky was clear. The kind of blue that doesn't ask anything of you. Behind us, the courthouse doors closed. And for the first time in a long time, my father no longer controlled the story. 3 weeks after the hearing, the town began to correct itself. Not loudly. Not all at once. That isn't how places like Millhaven change. They shift the way a shoreline shifts, grain by grain, conversation by conversation, until one day you realize the edge is no longer where it used to be. My father tried at first to hold the old line. At the feed store, he told someone that the court had overreached, that the government had papered over the situation, that things weren't as they appeared. The man he told that to was Bill Cawley's cousin. Bill had been sitting in the jury box when a sealed document from the Pentagon crossed a county bench, and a judge told the room to stand. The story didn't hold. It didn't need to be challenged. It simply didn't take. At church, the conversations shifted in tone. Not confrontational, not accusatory, just different. People asked fewer questions of him. They filled the silence he left with their own conclusions. The pastor stopped seeking his opinion before committee decisions. The invitations that had once arrived automatically began to require confirmation. At the diner, his usual seat remained open, but the rhythm changed. The waitress still poured his coffee. Habit doesn't break easily. But the easy back and forth, the nods of agreement, the small affirmations that had once reinforced his version of things, those thinned. Respect in a small town is rarely removed outright. It is withdrawn. Quietly. My father stopped going to the feed store after a month. He still attended church, but he sat further back. Beth called me 6 weeks after the hearing. I was at Fort Meade, standing in a hallway outside a secured room, my phone in my hand, the signal just strong enough to carry her voice without distortion. "Hi," she said. It was the same word she had used 100 times growing up. It sounded different now. "Hi," I said. There was a pause. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "That narrows it down," I said. A small, almost surprised laugh. "You always do that," she said. "Make it just sharp enough that I have to pay attention." That wasn't the goal. "I know," she said. "It just is." Another pause. "I wasn't asking," she said finally. "You were right." I leaned back against the wall. The building hummed around me, ventilation, distant footsteps, the low constant presence of systems doing what they were designed to do. "It's easy not to ask when the answers are already there," I said. "I thought they were," she replied. "Most people do." She exhaled slowly. "I don't need to know what you did," she said, "or do. I get that now. I need to know if there's still something there, between us." That was the real question. Not about the past. About the future. I let the silence sit for a moment. Not to punish. To be accurate. "There is," I said, "but it's not the same." "I know," she said quickly. "I'm not asking for that." "Good," I said, "because I don't have that to give." She accepted that. I could hear it in the way her breathing settled. "We can start where we are," she said. "That's the only place to start," I replied. We talked for 11 minutes. About small things. About neutral ground. About what could be said without stepping into what couldn't. When the call ended, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Not because I was unsure. Because I was adjusting. Relationships don't reset. They reconfigure. My father did not call. He wrote once. A letter. Handwritten. The paper was the same kind he had always used, lined slightly yellow, folded with precision. He did not apologize. That would have required a language he did not possess. He did not admit fault. That would have required a framework he had never needed. He wrote, "I didn't know." I read that sentence 3 times, not for emphasis, for meaning. I didn't know. It was both true and insufficient. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer. Not discarded, not displayed, stored. That felt appropriate. 7 months after the hearing, I established a scholarship, the Carter Rural Service Scholarship, for daughters of farming families entering public service, military or otherwise. 2 years of tuition at a state university. Renewable once. It wasn't large by national standards. In Millhaven, it was enough to matter. The ceremony was held at the county library. Small. Local. Intentional. Beth attended. She stood in the second row. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Presence was enough. My father was not invited. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. Some spaces are not meant to be shared. A brass plaque was mounted near the entrance. Simple. No rank. No titles. Just my name. Evelyn Carter. That was all that needed to be there. Back at Fort Meade, my office remained what it had always been. No decorations. No visible markers of what had been confirmed in that courtroom. A desk. A screen. A pin. The same small matte gray pin that had caught a judge's eye and reframed a case. I wore it the way I always had. Not for recognition, for continuity. There is a kind of freedom that comes when you no longer need to be understood by the people who once defined you. It is not loud. It is not triumphant. It is steady. For years my silence had been interpreted as absence, as evasion, as proof of something lacking. In that courtroom it became something else. Not a void. A boundary. My father had mistaken what he could not see for what did not exist. He had filled that space with a story that made sense to him. He had told it often enough that it felt like fact. He had taken it into a court of law expecting it to hold. It didn't. Not because I argued louder. Not because I exposed more. Because eventually the truth arrived with authority that did not require his approval. I didn't win that day. Winning implies opposition. This wasn't a contest. It was a correction. A realignment between what was said and what was. If you've ever been reduced to a version of yourself that fits someone else's comfort, if you've ever been told that what you've done doesn't count because it wasn't visible, if you've ever sat in a room where your silence was used against you, then you understand this. Not every truth needs to be explained. Some truths only need to be confirmed. And when they are, they don't just change the room. They change who gets to tell the story. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that quiet strength still carries weight, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want more stories like this, stories about dignity, family, and the moments that shift everything, consider subscribing. We share them every day. Let's keep going together.